Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Applin, the co-CEO of the World Trade Center Institute. On behalf of the entire WTCI team, we want to welcome you back to the 2020 Agile Innovation Series. Now, for those of you who've never attended an Agile session, these are sessions on innovation, breakthrough innovation, featured in TED Talk styled presentations with thought leaders tackling big global issues that CEOs and C-suite and companies are facing all over the world. If you have been with us for an Agile session, you know that we typically do these at the historic Parkway Theater in Baltimore. And while we won't be at the Parkway Theater gathered today for this presentation, we are very excited to be with you for our very first virtual Agile session, Innovations in Global Supply Chain. Now, before we get started with our program today, I'd like to recognize a few companies who make the Agile series possible. First, our visionary sponsor, Todd Rupert International. Our platinum sponsors, Lockheed Martin, Chase, and RSM. And finally, our gold sponsors, the Agora companies, Tesco, McCormick and Company, Emergent Biosolutions, Cushman & Wakefield, Japigo, Communications Electronics, Prometric, Pompeian, and Ports America Chesapeake. Thank you all for your support in making the Agile series possible. Now, next, I would like to welcome Alex Triantis. Today, our session is Global Supply Chain Innovations, featuring 3 dynamic speakers and industry leaders, and will be moderated by Alex. Each of our esteemed speakers will present, followed by a moderated panel with a live Q&A at the end. And throughout the presentation, if you have a question, please submit that question in the Zoom channel in the Q&A function. At the end of the presentation, we'll be taking those live questions. Now, we're thrilled to welcome Alex to his first Agile session. And I'm excited to share with you all that Carey Business School is the strategic partner with WTCI on the university partner with WTCI on the Agile series. Now, a little bit more about Alex's background. He came to Carey in 2019 from the Robert H. Smith School of Business, where he served as dean from 2013 to 2019. He received his PhD in industrial engineering from Stanford University and multiple degrees from the University of Toronto. And prior to joining the University of Maryland's faculty in 1995, he was a visiting scholar at MIT Sloan School of Management and an assistant and associate professor at the University of Wisconsin. Business Week named Triantis an outstanding professor at the University of Wisconsin and the University of Maryland, and he's a 2-time recipient of the Smith School's Top Teaching Award for faculty. Please join me in welcoming Alex Triantis.
Well, thanks very much, Susan, for that kind introduction. It is really my pleasure to moderate such a great panel on a very important and timely topic. During the past year, supply chain related issues have been repeatedly featured in the headlines, typically highlighting challenges that have had very significant impact on companies' operations, profitability, and value. Certainly, the pandemic has resulted in major disruptions in production and transportation, as well as unexpected spikes in demand for certain products. My colleagues at the Carey Business School have been very focused on studying these issues, including addressing critical supply issues in the health industry for PPE, ventilators, testing kits, and hopefully in the near future, vaccines. A year ago, however, the storyline was more focused on geopolitical disputes, including tariffs and other sudden disruptions to global trade. And risks related to weather events, sustainability, labor practices, and cyber threats only seem to be increasing. For many years now, companies have pursued a strategy of increasing globalization, not only to align with global consumption patterns, but also to minimize sourcing costs, typically due to lower labor costs. Now, companies are moving towards a more nuanced framework that trades off these efficiencies against the benefits of end-to-end supply chain visibility in order to identify various risks, and supply chain resilience, enabling the mitigation of these risks. Not surprisingly, we have seen significant innovations in managing supply chains, including the deployment of new data analytic techniques and new technology. And you will be hearing about this from our three panelists. Each one of our panelists will present for 10 minutes, and as Susan mentioned, we'll have the opportunity at the end for a Q&A session, which I look forward to. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our first panelist. Susan Lund is a partner at McKinsey, where she is also a leader of the McKinsey Global Institute and heads McKinsey's team that is modeling the impact of COVID-19 on economic growth. As a PhD economist, her research focuses on globalization and trade and the impact of technology on work and workers. Her articles have appeared in Harvard Business Review, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and Foreign Affairs. In addition to her work at McKinsey, Susan is a member of the Economic Advisory Board of the International Finance Corporation and a board director of the National Association of Business Economics. Susan, I'll turn it over to you now.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to share with you very briefly some research that we started before COVID on supply chain risk and resilience and released last month. You can all find it online. I'm going to share my screen right now and promise to be very brief. So I have three key messages. What we've done in this work has looked at, one, the fact that shocks to supply chains and therefore operations are more frequent and costly and severe for several reasons. Second, this ends up impacting companies' bottom lines. So we sized the impact on EBITDA over a 10-year period based on expected losses. And then finally, companies are starting to rethink the just-in-time production and supply chains that have been built and thinking about resilience in a new way. And I'll go through what does a resilient supply chain look like. I'm very excited to be followed by two panelists who will tell you what's happening on the ground within companies. So first, let's go through what risks are we thinking about. When companies in the past thought about risk to supply chains, they tended to think about the things in the bottom left of this matrix. You'll see that we've aligned a bunch of different risks based on the magnitude of shocks in terms of dollars of losses and the ability to anticipate the shock. So to the extent that companies have had risk management, they tended to focus on things like counterfeit, theft, a supplier bankruptcy, or a cyber attack. But what we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years is that indeed disruptions are severe. We have changes in regulation. We have chronic climate change events that are creating heat waves, wildfires, and sunny day flooding. We have geopolitical tensions around the world with different economic systems in a multipolar world competing for attention. We have pandemics. We have financial crises. We have more severe hurricanes and typhoons given higher global temperatures. So it's not a figment of your imagination. The world is truly a riskier place. We also have hypothetical events that haven't yet happened, but scientists tell us could. For instance, more extreme pandemics that are more deadly, or say a solar flare that took out part of the electrical grid, or a large-scale cyber attack that influenced the world's payment system. As part of the research, we did a survey of experts to find out how often do companies in different industries actually experience downtime in production due to some supply chain shock. And what we found is that they're actually quite common. On the right side of this chart, you'll see that companies can expect to have downtime in production of 1 to 2 weeks every 2 years, downtime of 1 to 2 months every 3.5 years, and 2 months or more every 4 to 6 years. So this is now adding up. What we used to think of as a random event that could never happen again, we're realizing happens year in and year out. And this is what's shifting the focus to how do you build resilience and make yourself a little bit immune to these shocks. Now, all of this translates into big financial impact. It varies, of course, by industry based on the characteristics of production and how frequently they see disruptions. But on average, a company can expect to lose 42% of 1 year's EBITDA over the course of a decade based on these supply chain disruptions. The impact is larger in industries that either have very high fixed costs, like automotive and mining and aerospace, or hold minimal levels of inventory. And you can find your industry on this chart, but the point is when CEOs say, why should I invest now in resilience to prevent a future loss? That's a hard sell for you. What you see is that companies are coming out with some measures to build resilience can actually improve productivity and efficiency right away. Now, one of the things that we hear about is that companies may shift the location of their supply chains. So we did a survey in May in the midst of the COVID pandemic. We found that 93% of supply chain leaders in the survey said that they plan to increase resilience. Even more surprisingly, we found that 45%, nearly 45% said that they would increase resilience at the expense of short-term efficiency. And that's because this realization is coming, that in fact, shocks are to be expected. They're not the unexpected anymore. Now, on the right, it shows you some of the actions. There are many different ways to build resilience. So top choice was dual sourcing. So for critical components where you've got one key supplier, it's developing a second supply source in a different country. Companies can hold more inventory. They can nearshore or regionalize their supply chains. This reduces transportation risk and also enables companies to work more closely with suppliers. You can do SKU rationalization or make products less complex and down the line. Many of these actions, though, could lead to a shift in global trade flows. So there's a lot of attention in North America right now about whether trade will shift as a result of COVID, coming on top of the US-China trade war, coming on top of hurricanes and so on. So we did a very rough assessment of what's the business case for moving the existing supply chains, and then what are non-economic factors. So for instance, have governments designated the products in your industry an essential good or important for national competitiveness or security? The gray circles on the left say there's very little impact diversifying existing supply chains because it's a hugely capital intensive industry. And requires a lot of specialized in the political spotlight. And there's targeting the semiconductor industry. So the black circle means very likely to see action there. So industry's different, but overall what we conclude is that somewhere between 15 to 25% of global trade could conceivably move to different sets of countries over the next 5 years. And that's either a big number if you thought nothing's going to change, or it's a small number if you thought everything should just be reshored. So moving your supply chain and developing additional supply sources is only one action that companies can take. So what does a resilient supply chain look like? We think it has 4 key elements. Very first is that you need end-to-end visibility, not just on your direct suppliers, but down in tiers 2, 3, and 4, so that you can see shocks rippling up in your suppliers' suppliers. You can identify weaknesses in the network. For instance, you may have a tier 2 supplier that actually is critical for several of your direct suppliers. So understanding the state of that company and what shocks they might be exposed to is incredibly important. After that, once you've got visibility, you can actually do stress testing and run scenarios. What if a hurricane hits in this part of the world? What if there is a conflict in the Middle East that disrupts transportation? Third is then to think about a portfolio of actions to either minimize your supply chain's exposure to shocks or minimize vulnerabilities. You can do this by holding more inventory, reducing leverage, making product design less complex with fewer unique components, and there are many different actions that can be taken. And then finally, I think that resilient supply chains have this clearly on the CEO agenda. This is no longer just a concern for the head of procurement, but it's truly a strategic and financial issue for companies, and it should squarely be on the agenda of the top team. So operationalizing this is going to require a lot of change for many companies. So on the right side, you'll see first you'll need resiliency metrics. So procurement officer not only about you'll need investor risk management capabilities to industrial supply chain issues. After the 2000 So that is a quick wrap up on what we found. And now I look forward to hearing from Alex and some of the other colleagues around what their companies are doing.
Well, Susan, thank you so much for your comments. Really appreciate it. And we'll dig deeper into some of your insights a little bit later. Again, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. I'd like to turn now to Tricia McRoberts. Tricia serves as head of America's procurement for McCormick & Company, which, as you all know, is a global leader in the manufacture of spices, herbs, and flavor solutions. In her role, Tricia delivers end-to-end supply chain solutions to drive margin-enhancing outcomes and enable strategic growth. Currently, Tricia is part of McCormick's Accelerator team, launching a new functional food brand that intersects science and wellness to elevate consumer health. Tricia also serves on the board of athletes serving athletes and the Business Alumni Advisory Council at her alma mater, the University of Arkansas, and she was an inaugural member of the World Trade Center Institute's EDGE Fellows. So Tricia, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Alex. It's great to be here with you today and to share with you some of the strategies that we are putting in place to drive the future growth of McCormick. So today here at McCormick, we are really focused on reinventing both the art and science of the future. And found a book on the bookshelf the other day called Supply Chain Saves the World, which was a previous AMR book that said, there will come a time when the work that we do will be extremely appreciated. And as we are navigating through some of the risk elements of this COVID world, that truly has become the case. So on this slide, you can really see a few different technology solutions that we have driven. Part of it is bringing 130 years worth of detailed growth into our design of new product development and transitioning that into consumer preferred solutions, whether that be to make your products taste good or to make your products better for you. Some other things that I'll tease you with here is you see that drone in the lower right hand corner. We're using drone technology throughout the globe to look at our farms to see what's happening and to ensure that we are driving quality, consistency, and technically advantaged solutions for our consumer base. In the area of global optimization, we are working with our technical innovation centers throughout the world and partnering with our science solutions to develop end-to-end vertical superiority and to make technically insulated flavor solutions that are consumer preferred. We have developed a number of partnerships with IBM and others to bring new solutions to the table, whether it be in our manufacturing footprint related to supply chain de-risking end-to-end, or smart factory and automated solutions. In the area of insight driving, we've taken over 130 years of manual documentation that our flavorists have had, and we've put that into automated AI technology that is developing new products at faster speeds, as speed is becoming the new currency in our world today. On the sustainability front, we have a purpose-led performance initiative that is bold and aggressive to ensure that as we are putting our solutions into place throughout the world, we are also doing good for the communities that we work and live in. On the science and powder front, we have a large number of work looking at advantaged flavors and solutions all the way from seed to source, so that you know when you're getting a McCormick product that there hasn't been any adulteration, that there aren't any areas within the product quality that will impact the end product design. And since 2000, we have been forward focused on predicting using both technology and consumer input around what are the flavors of the future, predicting 10 years in advance some things that you see mainstream today, like Chipotle or pumpkin spice lattes. Today, McCormick sources from over 80 countries throughout the world. And this is a very complex and challenging thing in this world environment as we work through different laws and regulations that come into play. And we've started to take the learnings from seed to source as we have worked through merger and acquisition work with the Frank's acquisition, $4 billion acquisition, and applied science and technology to be able to bring Frank's Red Hot not only to the US, but to other countries throughout the world, leveraging our global optimization footprint and putting into place some of the solutions that were here in the United States throughout the globe. As we think about how to build our technically advantaged supply chain, there are really 3 different levers that we are pursuing today. On the ground at the farm, we are applying agronomy and agrometrics to make sure that the yields are improving the output to drive our long-term revenue streams, and to make sure that we're able to drive scale and innovation for product solutions that will touch all of the global consumers. From a leveraging technology perspective, we have applied drone technology to count the number of cinnamon trees, which is a 7-year source. It takes a tree 7 years to grow, and it's very difficult to know how many trees there are to ensure that we have enough supply. So utilizing this drone technology, we've been able to count the number of trees, determine at what part of their life they are in, and plant the proper number so that we are balancing the supply and demand networks of this important part of our iconic raw material base. And in a test and learn environment, we are piloting a number of different growing environments that look at new ways to grow, applying ag technology and science to have superior quality and seed consistency, so the product that comes out in the end is the same every time the consumer utilizes it. One of the most exciting things that we've done on the artificial intelligence front is to, as I mentioned before, take 130 years of qualitative knowledge that our flavor solution partners and scientists and chemists have collected over the years. And we've been able to reduce the time to market on new product offerings to drive innovation at a faster speed. So for instance, we used to utilize a five-step stage gate process, and it may take 6 to 18 months to deploy a new product offering that goes through all of the steps and ensures that we have something that is consumer preferred. In our recent partnership with IBM, we've been able to take their platform for artificial intelligence and scale this technology across a number of new product offerings. So instead of taking 6 to 18 months, we take all of the learnings that have been built over time and skip over many of those steps to launch a new consumer preferred solution in a very quick period of time, some being in the record of 30 days or less, to help not only our consumer customers, but our flavor solutions customers bring innovation to market in a more quick speed. We've taken this technology and scaled it across the world to 20 labs throughout the globe and extending it by the end of this year to 14 new countries. By bringing new products to market at 3x the speed, we're able to drive innovation and to break into niche markets, whether that be in the functional food space or new areas that are growing as the economy and taste palettes and profiles change throughout the world. And finally, I'll share with you our Flavor Maker mobile app, which connects our pantries to our retailer. This is an app that you can download on your phone today, and it's become even more important during COVID, where people are not always able to get out to the store and not always able to find the products that they like through their normal channels. What this app does is it scans the sentiment that consumers, what they're making, it provides the recipes to them and automatically uploads the entire list so that shopping can be expedient and auto-ordered to drive what they want to cook into their kitchen. It also offers inspiration opportunities where if you don't have a recipe, it'll tell you what's in your pantry, when you need to replenish it, and also will drive you to recipes that uses what is already available within your pantry space. So between global optimization, end-to-end vertical superiority, and driving consumer preferred solutions, we are putting in place a number of technology inspired solutions to drive the future of McCormick and the future of saving the world from boring food. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tricia. And as we approach the lunch hour, I probably speak for all of us to say that just made me a little bit more hungry. So we'll turn now to Colin Brown. Colin is the Chief Operating Officer at Under Armour, which, as you all know, is a global leader in athletic apparel and equipment. And among his many CO responsibilities, Colin oversees the company's supply chain and sourcing operations, demand planning, distribution, and sustainability. Prior to joining Under Armour in 2016, Colin was Vice President and Managing Director of Supply Chain at VF Corporation, where he led all aspects of the company's sourcing and product supply organization in Asia and Africa. He also has held executive leadership positions with Li & Fung, Reebok, and Bally. Colin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Alex. You know, guys, it's always interesting when you follow such interesting speakers as Susan and Tricia, you know, and it always kind of puts my presentation into context, I guess. What I wanted to talk to you today about was really kind of how I see supply chain evolving, and from the point of view of how COVID perhaps and how existing themes have continued to kind of put pressure on supply chain and the way in which we should be thinking about potentially responding in the future towards that. But I want to start.
Colin, you hit mute by mistake.
Okay, hopefully I'm off mute now. I wanted to start with a little history, okay, I'm not going back to all the a little history with regards to perhaps sourcing and supply chains. I'm not quite going to go back to the you know, the Silk Road, but let's kind of start a little bit more recently than that, in kind of the 1700s, when really kind of sourcing as we know it today kind of kicked off. And Tricia talked about the spices and the business they had, and the spice trade was obviously a huge part of how we think of global sourcing and the way it originally kind of kicked off in the 1700s with the British and Dutch East India companies kind of sourcing nutmeg and other things from the Java, from the Indonesian islands. Now you can then kind of advance to, you know, the 17 and 1800s with the Industrial Revolution and how manufacturing really kind of started to pick up and started to kind of evolve globally. And it changed the way in which we think about manufacturing, you know, and it changed forever the way we think about manufacturing. Now, I would suggest that between kind of the 1900s and the 1980s, you know, we were manufacturing pretty close to the point of consumption. You know, generally speaking, you know, there was a huge manufacturing there was huge manufacturing plants here in the US and in Europe and elsewhere, and we were manufacturing very close to actually where we consume things. And then the 1960s I propose from the 1960s to 2020, we really started, certainly from my industry, we started chasing cheap labor. That was the comparative advantage of how we thought differently about how we were sourcing and running our businesses. Now, my own career, and just to give you a little background and tell you a little story, my own career started in the 1980s. I was one of these guys that perhaps started at the end of that kind of that manufacturing line to the point of consumption. And I started work in a shoe factory. I actually was one of these guys who started actually work on the factory floor about 40 odd years ago. I know, I was a child laborer, but let's not go into that. I still remember the days when I was running these factories in the UK, and my head of manufacturing, my head of sales would come to me and say, Colin, I need to get this product. I need to get them delivered to Bond Street tomorrow morning. And so what I would do is I'd kind of get the shoes crated up and I would get them loaded in a van and get them delivered to Bond Street. I didn't have this huge ERP system. I didn't have this huge I didn't have this huge warehouse management system. I didn't have all these systems for kind of aligning product and flowing product through. I wasn't thinking about container utilization and all these things. I was just thinking about how quickly I could get things delivered to the store. And it was a very linear, direct relationship. It was much quicker. You know, I didn't have huge amounts of inventory that I had to deal with. And many companies now, as we've kind of stood up this chasing cheap labor kind of model, you know, many companies now have huge amounts of inventory. You know, it's not unusual for companies now to have 90 days worth of inventory. And so, you know, that holding that 90, 120 days worth of inventory is starting to reach a point where I'm not sure that actually covers the comparative advantage we get from chasing cheap labor, especially since cheap labor isn't there anymore. So what does that mean for the future? I'm not necessarily sure that this model where we've always been chasing the comparative advantage of cheap labor, certainly from my industry, really makes sense. And I think, you know, COVID has really brought that into sharp relief. And so I think one of the things that we've learned as we've gone through COVID is we've seen this acceleration of existing themes. And so a lot of the things that I just kind of kicked off talking about from the point of view of how do we think of manufacturing is really kind of, COVID has really brought that put this under the magnifying glass even further. You know, one of the things we're finding is, certainly from our industry, there's no cheap labor anymore. You know, we tend to find, when I started doing this kind of role in the 1980s, you know, you could move from one country to another because the comparative advantage was so great that, that you could actually make those moves. You can't do that anymore. There's, you know, the difference between what you have in efficiency in an immature manufacturing country versus the efficiency you have in a mature manufacturing country is really kind of offset. You know, I use the advantage that I can go to Ethiopia and manufacture product, but it's 8 times less efficient than me manufacturing it in China. So, you know, but the costs are 8 times cheaper. But does that kind of work anymore? I'm not sure it does. You know, cheap labor is no longer the big unlock. One of the other things that's happened is our consumption now is global. You know, when I think of when I started work in this industry, you know, places like China was not a major market for the consumption of goods. And increasingly, I'm having to think about how do I manufacture goods to service every market in the world. Historically, you know, going back a few years, we were really only thinking about consumption into the US or into the UK, sorry, or into Europe. But that's not the case anymore. I have to think about global consumption. That also requires me to start to think globally, but act locally. How do I think about the way in which I'm managing supply chain on a global basis, but how do I make sure that I'm able to respond to those local kind of nuances and those local challenges that I have? And again, you know, the old model of just kind of chasing cheap labor around the world perhaps doesn't allow me to achieve that. You know, and Susan talked about supply chain resiliency, and you know, COVID has really highlighted the fact that you know, this is an incredibly important part of a supply chain leader's role, to think about how do we build a supply chain that is resilient and can manage and stand these shocks. Sometimes to the detriment of margin. You know, if I can, it's far better to be guaranteed to be able to guarantee that I'm going to be able to deliver product, as opposed to necessarily being able to deliver, as opposed to necessarily being able to source cheap product and not being able to deliver it. It doesn't make sense anymore. You know, you have to think about how you balance those things, those two things together. We're also seeing, you know, data and automation having such a big impact on the way in which we run our supply chains. You know, all of a sudden, I now have such a level of information available to me I can really think very differently about where I'm positioning inventory to service each market based upon the data and the information that's available globally. So thinking about how do I use data to drive things differently, and how does data and automation allow me to potentially manufacture things differently? You know, there's a lot of moving pieces in here that kind of that we're really only now trying to kind of unlock, and I think this next chapter is going to be an important part of that as well. And COVID has really kind of forced us to rethink about the e-commerce part of the business and how e-commerce is accelerating across the globe, because more and more people are just going online and shopping online. And that's an interesting kind of comment. And Tricia's comment about supply chain one day will be heroes kind of thing, her kind of observation is very true. And I kind of have been having this conversation with a number of my colleagues for a while. You know, historically, from a brand point of view, the last point of contact that you would have with a customer would be from your store. But now, quite often, the last point of contact you have with your customer is from your warehouse, from the supply chain. So how do we, from a supply chain point of view, think about how do we manage that fulfillment globally in a very different way, especially if we're often that last point of contact? So how do we, even from a supply chain point of view, start to delight the customers that we're kind of working with? So there's a number of themes that I think that are playing out here, and we're really trying to understand at this moment in time. So what strategies are we kind of thinking about here at Under Armour? Well, you know, I think the first one is kind of to meet customers where and how they choose to engage. You know, putting customers at the center of everything you do is incredibly important. And, you know, and deciding and working through how you are going to engage with your customers is the key to, you know, is a huge part of the key to success. The second thing, which to me is kind of what I call establish mad global local relationships with suppliers. The days in which I would chase from one supplier to another supplier to just get a lower price in another country has long gone. I need to now have global suppliers that I can also have local relationships with. So suppliers that I can have manufacturing in China, manufacturing in Latin America, and manufacturing in Europe with the same supplier. And they are able to serve those local markets. And when I call it MAD, the reason I call it MAD is mutually assured destruction. How do I have mutually assured destruction relationships where their well-being is as important as my well-being? And if I fail, they fail. If they fail, I fail. So we've really got to work through how we build those symbiotic kind of relationships as well. I think it was Winston Churchill that said plans are useless, but planning is everything. You know, if we are going to build a supply chain and that really kind of aligns with consumers and thinks through how we use the data that's available, then we really need to think through how we are running our planning organization. And to me, the idea of demand planning and really understanding the insight that new forecasting tools can bring to us is huge, and will allow us to run our supply chains very differently as well. Data to information and information to hindsight. You know, we've talked a lot about how data is the new oil, but you know, data is only the new oil if you know your car needs gasoline versus diesel. You know, just having data is not particularly useful. You need to really understand what data you need and what data you can use to inform the insights that you need to run your business. And that's going to be incredibly important. I think it's only something we're really only now starting to unpick and really understand how to use that data to really drive the business and to give us the insights with regards to how to move things forward. You know, innovation, you know, for a brand like Under Armour, and this is perhaps more of an Under Armour kind of a comment than anything else, but innovation is incredibly important. We are a performance athletics brand, and, you know, the innovation we bring to everything we do is what separates us from the rest of the pack and allows us to kind of lead. And the last one I kind of call Avengers Assemble. And hopefully some of you guys have watched the Avengers movies, which is where they kind of assemble the group of superheroes, the best superheroes in the world, all come together to save the world. Well, as an HR strategy, Avengers Assemble is kind of my HR strategy. How do I assemble the best people in the world that have all those superpowers that can help me unlock each of those different parts of the kind of the process as we go forward? So in summary, what's the future look like? Well, you know, this is not a very sexy way of putting it, and at some point in time, I'm going to have to come up with a more sexy way of putting it. But I think we're moving to a world where bespoke manufacturing aligned with the point of consumption is going to be kind of how we move forward. To a degree, we're almost kind of going back to the future. I can see us almost going back to a world where we're having a lot more local manufacturing that is servicing, or at least regional manufacturing that is servicing local consumption. That doesn't mean I think all our manufacturing is going to charge back to the US or charge back to Europe or elsewhere. But there will be parts and there will be sections of our product that will be manufactured in the right locations to basically allow us to get closer to a consumer and to manage and that will be the unlock for the future. At least that's my opinion on how we're going to take this industry forward.
Colin, thanks so much. Great insights. And I'd like to now invite Tricia and Susan back on, as well as Susan Applin, if you could join us as well. And we've already started to receive some great questions. So I want to address all the ones that Deb, Wally, and Pete have put on the Q&A board, and others, please feel free to do so. I think it might be useful to kind of talk a little bit about COVID and then talk about sort of the more general issues regarding trade-offs that companies have between the short run and the long run and so on. So first of all, there's, I'm sure, as it seems, particularly Pete's question for Colin, an interest in finding out sort of when did you first find out, how did you react, how quickly you reacted, and so on. So Colin and Tricia in particular, maybe for the two of you, if you could talk a little bit about that. And it also, Susan, if you have some thoughts about this from the end-to-end visibility perspective that you talked about, that a lot of this is about identifying risk as quickly as you can in order to be able to react. So maybe you have some thoughts on that. But Colin, maybe you could start with Pete's exact question was, what was Under Armour's initial reaction when COVID lockdown started? Did you cut your supply, hold, increase, and what would you do differently if you could go back and do it again?
Well, I think remembering this started in Asia. So it initially hit us as a supply issue. So it didn't really kind of start the lockdowns. It started much earlier than that. So as this started to play out in China and then started to roll out globally from the manufacturing, because remember, we manufacture about 50% of what we produce in Asia. So it started off very much as a supply issue. But we quickly, one of the things I think we did a nice job of is we quickly assumed, and in these risk scenarios and the way in which we thought about building these scenarios out, and I'm sure Susan will kind of probably even talk to that, we kind of modeled what we would need to do if this kind of went global. So we already kind of knew what we were going to do. And then it quickly became a perfect storm from a supply chain point of view, from the point of view it was impacting supply and demand. So you then ended up with this perfect kind of storm where you have both things going on at the same time. And we actually very quickly pivoted and stood up a group called Project Buffalo. And the reason we called it Project Buffalo, buffaloes actually don't, when there's a storm, buffaloes just put their head down and they walk straight into the storm to get through it as quickly as they can. And that's what we did. We put our head down and said, Project Buffalo, we're going to just drive our way through this as quickly as we possibly can. And we adjusted our supply to basically, and we over adjusted our supply, assuming that was going to impact our demand. And I think we did a reasonably good job of managing that, because we looked at all the different decision points that we had to make. We actually had a ratio of 30 different decision points. If we cancel this now, how much is it going to impact revenue? How much is it going to impact inventory? How much is it going to impact our net promoter score? And we kind of did all of that work at the time, at the same time. And it was an intense month. And we also then shifted our next month's production and next season's production out and made lots of adjustments around that. So I think overall, I think we did a fairly good job. I think there's a couple of things that, in retrospect, we ended up, I'm not sure if I should even say this, we ended up taking things back from our retail stores. And I'm not sure if we should have done that, actually, because I think some of our competitors didn't do that. And they may have had a little bit of an easier run because they automatically have all their inventory sitting in the stores as soon as the business picked up again. Whereas we were sitting there saying, well, we'll be good partners and take some of that inventory back. And in retrospect, I think we'd probably do that differently.
Thanks, Colin. Well, Tricia, you all had the kind of problem that a lot of people like to have, right? Is that I'm sure you had a spike in demand with everybody eating at home and so on, and other channels maybe as well on the fast food side, et cetera. So I'm kind of curious, both on the demand side, how you were able to adapt quickly, as well as, I think you said 80 countries that you source for were, what about, and maybe also to tie in this question that Stephen asked about the issues of transportation, of freight capacity and loss of air capacity, and whether or not that had an impact as well.
Sure. So we actually immediately activated a global team back in January, which was, I think, in the early stages of when America was still in denial of what COVID was going to bring. But we have a plant in Wuhan and we have a plant in Guangzhou. And when the very first case came to be, we knew there were going to be challenges. So every week we would have a very active team around what is happening on the ground. And we pulled out the insights from our data around what we were contracting from China and what we were contracting from India. And we immediately implemented an inventory plan to proactively get ahead of anything that would have potential challenges with logistics. So our strategy was to get ahead of those port challenges and make sure we had enough stateside to keep our plants running. The second thing that we did was put together 3 principles of how we wanted to operate in this environment. And it was really centered around employee safety. So if we can't keep our plants running here, we can't keep our consumer supply and demand in check. And the other one was around, focusing on how do we keep our customers and our consumers in supply when there was a major shift between the demand of cooking at home trends versus going out to eat, and a reduction on the food service side of our business. And the third piece of it is how do we learn every week so that we can emerge stronger. So we started deploying recognition case studies around what's working well and how can we quickly deploy that, whether it's in our EMEA region, our China region, or our APZ region. And we did, to your point, have significant growth during this time because everybody is cooking more. Vanilla went through the roof. Turmeric is going through the roof as people start to believe that there may be some benefits to COVID prevention by taking more of it. So we've really enjoyed some significant growth to the tune of an entire acquisition of growth in 1 year. So in that regard, that was quite challenging to maintain our supply. So we had to put in place a SKU rationalization program to target our top 400 SKUs and ensure that we were keeping our most important items in stock as we navigate this time. And then finally, one thing that we were really lucky about is we had just executed a finished good build to transition into a new ERP system. So we pivoted quickly and said, we're going to utilize this inventory to give to our customers, and we are going to delay our ERP implementation to provide our capacity constrained manufacturing footprint an opportunity to build up inventory, because we know there's going to be, the first phase of COVID is not the end of this. This is going to be a 2 to 3 year cycle that works through our end-to-end supply chains.
Great, thanks, Tricia. Susan, I'll turn it over to you. Again, you've got sort of a perspective of looking at a variety of different industries and thinking about sort of macro effects. So maybe you could talk about some of these issues as well, and what you're seeing in terms of sort of early companies that are able to detect early and have great visibility, and what we've learned through COVID.
Yeah, so I've enjoyed the comments from Colin and Tricia. I don't want to repeat what they've said. I think I will underscore one thing Colin said was companies that could realize that this was going to be a supply shock and demand shock simultaneously were very far ahead of the game. So it wasn't just about supply chain, but pivoting towards e-commerce or different consumer channels, rethinking marketing so that you're marketing what you already produced rather than what you thought you would be producing because production went down. And companies that could do that very quickly have come out ahead. I will actually say the auto industry has done remarkably well at ratcheting back 2021 production so that we don't have a glut of new cars on the market. Those of you who are in the market for a new car, sorry, but you haven't seen huge price cuts and deals, because that's an industry that had traditionally been further ahead in digitizing its supply chain and being pretty sophisticated given the complexity of their products. And that really paid off. I will bring out the logistics, the transportation logistics challenges, which nobody's talked about. 50% of air cargo went through the belly of passenger flights. So one of the first things that dried up was international travel, and indeed it's still down by over half. And so that created a huge shortage in air cargo. Cargo container shipping got completely messed up with containers sitting on the wrong sides of oceans and ships sitting off port that couldn't unload. And that takes a long time to unravel. When you think about the complexity of getting that container shipping back on board. So I think that a lot of the challenges were in transportation networks as well. Goods weren't where they were projected to be. And in some cases, it's taken until now to actually get those kinks worked out of the market.
Thanks,
And
Susan.
they're still not worked out.
And still not worked out.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure if Trisha's saying this, but I'd be intrigued to hear her comments. Sorry, Alex, I'm going to jump. But we're finding major issues with e-com delivery at the moment. The transportation, because everyone's moving to shopping online, there's major kind of bottlenecks in thinking about how you get e-commerce delivered at the moment. It's a major kind of issue that everyone's dealing with, and the holiday is going to just make that, the holiday season is going to just make that much worse.
Yeah, and it's not just e-commerce, it's food delivery, it's
Exactly.
delivery, it's everything delivery.
Yeah, completely agree. We do a weekly weekly consumer sentiment survey. And in the early weeks, one of the interesting findings was that 40% of e-commerce consumers were ordering e-commerce for the first time in their life. So it's really spanning to entire new generations that are moving to e-commerce as their primary mode of consuming goods.
Well, if we have time, we may come back to kind of the problems du jour here, but I want to address a couple of questions that Wally and Deb had brought up, and it basically gets back to this notion of the trade-off, right, between, as Colin sort of through your historical view of, everybody was driving towards the larger margins, bringing down the costs of production and generally sourcing. As Deb mentioned, just in time has been sort of the mantra and so on. And now we're all saying, okay, resiliency. And so, Susan, you talked about dual sourcing and nearshoring and increased inventory. And we know all of these things are going to deteriorate margins. And as Wally pointed out, shareholders are still a little bit too focused on the short term, right? And so as a result, many of you feel that pressure as well. So Susan, you had mentioned, I think at the very end of your presentation, a little bit about sort of the CEO mandate and about governance. And I'm just kind of curious, starting with you, if you could talk a little bit about, are shareholders willing to sort of understand that margins may give a little bit at the result of greater stability or guarantees, as one of you mentioned in your remarks?
Well, time will tell, but I think that at least a subset of investors gets that. And maybe the whole ESG movement helped us out, because as investors started to focus on environmental impact, social impact of various supply chains, that's taking a longer term view. But I think that a really good investor communication strategy is going to be important. I like to say we need to go from just in time to just in case. And we built these supply chains, many of them, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. The world has changed since then. We built them to optimize costs in a world that we're no longer in. We're in a world where various factor costs have changed. Colin mentioned where consumption is happening has also changed. And the world is hotter. We've got more frequent weather. We've got a multipolar world with lots of geopolitical tensions. So the world has changed. We've got to rethink optimizing now for the new reality, but also taking that longer term multi-year view. And that's what justifies giving up a little bit today to have the stability in earnings over time.
Great. Colin, Tricia, other thoughts?
Completely agree. I think increasingly now we are, and this kind of the way in which I'm encapsulating it is, for a long time we spent a lot of our time thinking about the first cost, for want of a better way of putting it, how much it cost us to actually land a product. And actually the cost really is not about how much it costs us to land a product from a P&L perspective. It is how much the last cost is. How much did it cost us when we eventually close it out at the end of the line? How much does it cost us in delays? How much does it cost us in lost sales? How much are we going to have to discount it? that final cost of how much is really where I think we'll be able to unlock that value. And yeah, listen, consumers shareholders still will expect us to be making the same money. And I think, that's why I think the acceleration of those themes, it will dictate that we have to move quicker to that kind of model, and we'll get there, and because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I agree that the pedal is not going to be removed on delivering the financials to our shareholders. I do think that we will start to emerge with some new metrics throughout all of this that address instantaneous capacity in the end-to-end supply chain, and when a disruption event occurs, how long is that time to recovery?
Are you also finding stronger support? So we're talking about end-to-end visibility, but there's also end-to-end resilience, right? If somebody tier 2 or tier 3 does not have built-in resilience, you're going to feel it as well. Is there a sense in your industries that there's stronger cooperation, support, certainly through COVID, where some suppliers have been going bankrupt, where companies are sort of reaching out to try to help them financially as well? Or any stories or insights you want to share on that?
We implemented a more rigorous view, anticipating that we would see more bankruptcies by this point in time. I would say that maybe delayed a bit. So we still think it's coming, but it hasn't at least materialized in our industry yet. But I do think that is a risk that we are proactively trying to get a sense for. There are also full industries that are winners in this. So you look at packaging suppliers and the amount of, everybody wants hand sanitizer. So every incremental piece of packaging, no matter what it is pumping out to new manufacturers coming up and taking away all of the capacity with entire industries. So I think we'll continue to see disruption, but we're also going to continue to see some real winners that come out of this from an industry perspective.
Yeah, I would just say I think it's accelerated the consolidation of supply chains as well. Consolidation from the point of view of balancing consolidation and risk mitigation. So it doesn't mean we're going to move everything into one country, but it's trying to get that balance right between consolidation. And it's a little bit of a contradiction, but you've also had a lot of brands and a lot of companies went into cash preservation mode, and the first thing in order to preserve their cash for their own survival, a lot of companies extended credit terms to their basically extended credit terms they have in place with their suppliers, so they lengthen credit terms to protect their own cash. So, but at the same time, I think certainly from an Under Armour perspective, we've been working for some time at kind of building really deep strategic relationship with fewer suppliers, and we just kind of hunkered down with those suppliers that are important, that we have those relationships with, both at tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, to really kind of guarantee that we've got that sense of supply and guarantee that they survive as well.
Maybe Susan, I'll ask one final question to Susan Lund on this. Just quick global perspective. You talked about trillions of dollars of trade that's going to be disrupted, and there's a lot of discussion about, so who are the winners and the losers? Any macro thoughts you want to leave us with?
Look, I think that there are opportunities and risks for every company and every country. I think, as Colin pointed out, the locus of consumption is China and Asia more broadly. When you look at where the growth is going to be in 2020, when you look 5 years out at where the consumer spending growth is, it's Asia. So don't write off globalization just yet. But I do think that when it comes to supply chains and exporting production, we may see some movement, and it really varies by industry. But I think that we have turned a corner, and the freewheeling, chasing cheap labor, as Colin called it, go anywhere in the world, I think that's over, both politically and from a business perspective as well.
Yes. Thanks, Susan. I'm going to turn it back to Susan Applin now.
Thank you, everyone. Well, thank you, Alex, and thank you, Carey Business School. Just want to say a couple of words about Carey and our partnership, but today, Carey is shaping business leaders who are seizing opportunity and inspiring change and creating long-lasting value, and have an impressive faculty of thought leaders that are trailblazing what's next in the business world and classroom. We can't thank you enough, Alex, for moderating today. And I also want to thank our esteemed panel for bringing various perspectives on supply chain and innovations, and also resiliency in the supply chain. So next up, here we go. You can turn off your videos, if you will. Next slide. Next up in the Agile series on October 21st, we have an incredible session on innovations in cybersecurity. We're excited to have the head of cyber solutions from Lockheed Martin, Tom Warner, also the principal, Charles Barley at RSM, as well as Paul Phipps, the chief digital officer from Under Armour, who will share more details about the Under Armour breach, but also share what you need to do as a company to be ready when you are breached. So very exciting session. So mark your calendars, October 21st. And a couple of events just around the corner in a week and a half that are not Agile related. We have on September 29th, the 14th annual Women Spanning the Globe Conference. A great slate of speakers, more than 40 speakers this year. Our keynote is Olympic champion Dominique Dawes, who will talk to us about turning curiosity into courage. And we have other amazing speakers like Diane Hoskins, co-CEO of Gensler, the largest architect firm in the world, who's going to talk on a session, Think Like a CEO. And on September 30th, please join us for the Maryland International Business Leadership Awards. It's the Year of the Woman, and Governor Hogan will be here to present these awards. Both of these events will be virtual, but we've got impressive winners this year, and we look forward to you joining that. And then finally, that concludes our Agile session today. If you haven't registered for Women's, or you haven't registered for the International Business Leadership Awards, please do so. And we look forward to seeing you back on October 21st. Thank you all.